So we're at the restaurant, and there are, oh, and another part of this is that Howard had his office at home. And the person who worked for him was there still working when I left that evening. And so I went over to the restaurant, met my sister and brother-in-law and our other guests, and my daughter Ruth was there. And we were waiting for Howard and Rachel. And it got to be well over an hour. And they didn't come. And I inherited from many, many generations a worry gene, and I didn't feel right about it. But I waited a little while longer, and then I called the cell phone and got no answer. One of the things about Howard was he was a pretty reliable guy, and my feeling was that if he could, he would have called me. So I had not a very good feeling about this. I think I called Nick, who worked for Howard at the office, to ask if he'd heard anything. And he had not at that point. So we continued to wait. And then Nick called the restaurant and said, you're going to get a call from the highway patrol at the restaurant. They called, I guess, they called on the, I remember going to the payphone, I don't know why. And the highway patrolman said, I'm calling to tell you there's been a fatal accident. And I asked, both of them? And he said, yes, they had both died. So I remember Ruth asking what happened. And I said there was an accident, and she said, are they okay? And I said, no, they're not okay. They died. They both died. Ruth was 13 and a half at this point. We got home. I think that my sister must have called my lifelong friend. Ruth asked if she could call a friend of hers who came over with her mom, who was a single woman at that time. And I guess they made all the phone calls to everyone who needed to know about this. And of course, the people of my congregation were among the people who were notified. And I'm told that, of course, people were showing up at the synagogue for my bat mitzvah and learned that instead of bat mitzvah that there was going to be a funeral. It's hard for me to imagine what it would be like to go to the cemetery and then come home and be alone. We had many, many, many people at the house. There were probably close to 1,000 people at the funeral. And hundreds of people came every day. I was in shock, and I was also, part of me was kind of outside myself, kind of looking and learning about things that, until you encounter something that's so shocking as this, you don't really understand the impact. For a lot of young people, the parents of my children's friends, this was their first encounter with a death of a parent, of someone, and I learned a lot about what the kids were thinking. Parents told me, that their kids asked, well, if my dad died, would I be able to stay in my house? Would I be able to stay at my school? what would it be like? And I also, got an insight into the importance of being part of a community because of how many people were there for me. I have a sense that I probably wasn't really alone for a long time. And then also the other thing is that my husband's business operated out of our house, which I mentioned before. And so those people were there. I say, and it's now 17 years later, that if I hadn't had another child, or if my daughter had been in that car, my younger daughter had somehow, gone and been in the car and been in that accident, I might still be under the covers. You have to kind of get back to your life when you have a child who you have to take care of. You can't indulge your own self when there's another person involved whose life you're responsible for. We decided that we were, as a family, always went to Colorado skiing in December, winter holiday. We've been doing that for a number of years. And Ruth and I decided that we were going to make our trip, and in fact we invited her friend who she had called that day and her mom to come on our trip with us. But Ruth and I were traveling out there on our own, and then they were going to join us. So we were on a flight that encountered some weather, and we ended up having to stay overnight at an interim spot because of very bad weather in Colorado. And the airline, which was a new one that didn't stay in business very long, didn't have a clue of how to deal with this. And we ended up, instead of having a flight from Colorado Springs to Aspen, we ended up on a bus with all the other people from our flight, or other flights, who were grumbling a lot. And I said to Ruth, these people think this is a tragedy. Well, I would say moving beyond that particular day, I guess in general, be as reassuring as you can be that you will do what you can to keep life moving along. It will never be the same. But someone else gave me advice. Once a little time had passed, I was dealing, of course, with the business matters, and I didn't have an official job in my husband's business, but there were certain tasks that I had responsibility for, and tried to figure out how to carry those on. But I also was I didn't have at that time a paid job, but I had a lot of community responsibilities. I was on lots of committees and boards and so on, and I decided that what I wanted to do, or what I thought I should do, was try to fulfill all those things. Get back to normal as soon as possible. And again, I wish I knew the name of the person who gave me this advice. I can't even think of who it was, but somebody said to me, and of course my daughter was 13 and a half, and she, even absent this shocking event as a typical teenager, she didn't express a lot of desire to be in the same room with me or the same planet. And so someone said to me, you need to stay home more. You don't have to fulfill all those other obligations. And even if Ruth is acting like she doesn't want to be with you, she needs you to be at home. And I heard that, and I took it very seriously, and I cut back as many activities as I could. Now, of course, I had the luxury of not having to have a paid job that I had to get back to, so this wouldn't work for everybody. But nevertheless, I would say that to the extent that it's possible to be there, even if it's just being in the, in proximity. You don't have to be in the same room, you don't have to be having a conversation or anything, But that was really good advice, because I feel that it was very comforting to Ruth, who, if you looked at her from the outside, she looked very tough and not needy. But I think that it was really a good idea for me to be at home as much as I could. Biggest help to her was, and this was a mixed blessing, Rachel had left Hunter High School after 11th grade to go to this school, Simon's Rock. And of course, all of her friends from Hunter were still there. She had friends who went to other schools too, very typical of city kids. They have lots of different communities. But particularly the Hunter kids, mostly the girls, were really great with Ruth. And without any, certainly nothing I did brought this about, and I have the sense that it wasn't anything that their moms and dads suggested to do. I think just, it was a strong relationship that they had with Rachel, and they were very attentive to Ruth, who was also at Hunter. And I guess she was in 8th grade. She was in 8th grade at that time. And they kind of embraced her and were big sister to her collectively. And I think that helped her tremendously. What got me through was having friends and having community. Of course, having a purpose in life helps. Whatever your obligations are, you have to get back to them, and that is helpful. One thing I remember vividly was I had a certain friend who I would see, and in the first few months after the accident, and every time she saw me, she would just basically melt into tears. And she wasn't even one of my very closest friends. I'd known her a long time, and she'd known me and my family, but it wasn't like she was our most intimate friend to be so impacted. And I went to my therapist. I said, I don't get it. Every time I see her, she's crying more than I'm crying. And he said, well, she's taking it in, but your mind and body are protecting you and letting you take it in a little bit at a time. I never went to a bereavement group. Some people encouraged me to do that. My feeling was that while I certainly knew that there are sadder stories still, I felt that this story was such a shocking one and so extreme that I was loath to share it with anybody else who was also bereaved, as though, it was like some kind of, can you top this? So I didn't want to do that. But I also was mindful there always are sadder stories, and I could tell you any number of them. 50,000 people, I don't know if the number has changed, but at that time I read that 50,000 people die in car accidents in this country. I was not a person who was going to say, why me? I don't, my religious belief, my theology is not one that believes in a kind of God who intervene, a personal God who makes plans for us or intervenes in our life, either totally whimsically or because of things that we've done right or wrong. I feel that things that happen and not because there's some other worldly being. Friendships and understanding and people who are willing to just sort of sit there and be there. And of course, then you also learn the people who are not there for you, and that people who you might have expected would be more helpful and kinder and attentive. That sometimes you get, you learn a lot.
Right.
You learn a lot, and it does always put things in perspective. What is valuable and important. People don't know what to say. and that's okay. I never held it against anybody. I mean, you know, sometimes people react, as I just did, with like kind of a nervous laugh. I would run into people who were unaware of the story, and I would say, I guess you don't know what happened, and I would briefly tell what happened, and they would say something like, you're kidding. Well, of course I wasn't kidding, and you know, they knew I wasn't kidding, but you know, the words come out of your mouth because you don't know, and I'd like to think that I'm a very tolerant person and have become increasingly so, because you don't know what people are carrying around with them. I know for me it was important never to make a taboo to speak about Howard and Rachel, and I follow that, you know, to this day. I am comfortable with, you know, where I am with Ruth, and she's an amazing person who's extremely well adjusted with many talents and circle of friends, and you know, lives a very full life. So, you know, I know that she's come through. I think that when her sister's friends came and embraced her, that was very helpful to her. But I can't tell you, well, you know, I like to think that I've been helpful to her by being open to thinking and talking about what happened, and you know, the past, as though, you know, there's a continuum, and to you know, just be open and available to her. But as far as what she thinks, you know, worked for her,